Daniel Whitmore leaned across the polished conference table and slid a single sheet of paper toward the woman he had once promised to love forever. "Sign it, Emily. You walk away with nothing, and if you fight me, I'll make certain the entire world believes you've lost your mind." He smiled as he said it, the way a man smiles when he already knows he's won. 14 years of marriage, and he was ending it like a business transaction. What Daniel didn't know was that Emily had stopped being afraid 3 months ago, and she had come prepared. Before we go any further into this story, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and follow Emily's journey all the way to the end, because what happens in that courtroom will stay with you for a long time. And do me one small favor, leave a comment telling me the city you're watching from right now so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The lawyers had told Daniel that morning that everything was in place. His attorney, Victor Caldwell, the most expensive and most feared divorce lawyer in California, had assured him there would be no surprises. "She has no money, Daniel. No money means no fight. By the end of the week, the judge signs, the press writes their headlines, and you go on with your life exactly as you planned it." Daniel had liked hearing that. He liked hearing it very much. So when he walked into the Los Angeles Superior Court that first morning, he walked in like a man attending a party he had thrown himself. He adjusted his cufflinks. He shook hands with reporters he recognized. He let his eyes drift across the crowded gallery, all those faces waiting to watch the collapse of Emily Whitmore, and he felt something close to joy. Then he saw her. Emily was already seated at the far table. She was thinner than he remembered, quieter, her hands folded in her lap, like a woman waiting for a bus. She didn't look up when he entered. She didn't flinch. And that, more than anything, made a small, cold thread of unease move through Daniel's chest, though he pushed it away almost immediately. "She looks broken," Victor whispered as they took their seats. "Good. Broken is easy." "She's always been easy," Daniel murmured back. 14 years. I could tell that woman the sky was green and she'd apologize for noticing the blue. But Emily had heard something different in those 14 years. She had heard every time Daniel told her she was too emotional to understand their finances. She had heard him tell their friends at dinner after dinner that poor Emily had been under a lot of stress lately. She had heard the locks on the accounts click shut, one by one, felt the credit cards decline at the grocery store, watched the house she had decorated with her own hands become a place she needed permission to enter. She had heard all of it, and she had written every word of it down. The judge, a stern woman named Honorable Patricia Reyes, called the room to order. "We are here in the matter of Whitmore versus Whitmore. I expect professionalism from both sides. I have read the preliminary filings, and I'll be honest, counselors, I have concerns. Let's not waste the court's time." Victor rose smoothly. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Whitmore, has been more than fair. Despite the emotional and financial damage inflicted on him during this marriage, he is offering a settlement that reflects his generosity and his character." At the other table, Emily's attorney did not stand right away. Rachel Morgan was young, calm, and almost unnervingly patient. She let Victor finish. She let him make his speech. Then she rose slowly, buttoned her jacket, and said only, "We object to the characterization, Your Honor. We'll let the evidence speak." Daniel almost laughed out loud. Evidence? What evidence could Emily possibly have? He turned to Victor and mouthed the word, and Victor gave a small dismissive shrug as if to say, "Let them try." But Emily was watching Daniel now. For the first time that morning, she lifted her eyes and looked directly at the man who had tried to erase her, and she did not look away. That night, Daniel returned to the penthouse he had once shared with her, the penthouse she was no longer allowed inside, and he poured himself a drink and called the one person who knew everything. "Marcus," he said, "it's done. First day went exactly how we wanted." On the other end of the line, Marcus Reed, Daniel's business partner of 19 years, sounded less certain. "You sure about the lawyer she hired, Morgan? I looked into her. She doesn't take cases she can't win." "She took this one," Daniel said. "That tells you how desperate Emily is. Or how confident Emily is." Daniel laughed, but the laugh was thinner than he wanted it to be. "Emily hasn't been confident about anything since the day I married her. Trust me, Marcus, I know that woman better than she knows herself." But here was the thing about a man like Daniel Whitmore. He had spent so many years building the story of who Emily was, so many years telling everyone that she was fragile and foolish and lost, that he had come to believe his own story completely. He had forgotten that people are not stories. People change. And a person who has been underestimated for 14 years learns patience the way a stone learns the shape of water. The next morning, Daniel took the stand. Victor guided him through it like a conductor leading an orchestra. "Mr. Whitmore, how would you describe your marriage in its final years?" Daniel let his shoulders drop, let his voice go soft and wounded. "Difficult. I tried, Your Honor. I really did. But Emily became someone I didn't recognize. She was suspicious of everyone. She spent money we didn't discuss. She accused me of things that weren't true. I loved her, but you can't save someone who won't be saved." The gallery ate it up. Reporters scribbled. A few people nodded sympathetically. Daniel could feel the room tilting toward him, and it felt like standing on a stage he had built himself. "And the finances?" Victor asked. "There have been suggestions that you controlled the household money." "I managed it," Daniel corrected gently. "Someone had to. Emily didn't want the responsibility. She said herself more than once that numbers gave her headaches. I protected her from stress. I see now that protection was mistaken for control." It was a beautiful performance. It was also, from the first word to the last, a lie. Rachel Morgan wrote nothing during his testimony. She simply watched him, her pen resting still against the legal pad, and every so often she made a tiny mark in the corner of the page, a mark only she understood. Emily sat beside her, breathing slowly, her heart hammering behind a face that gave nothing away. When Victor finished, Judge Reyes turned to Rachel. "Cross-examination, counsel." "Just a few questions, Your Honor." Rachel stood, and the room seemed to lean in without knowing why. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice light, almost friendly, "you said you managed the household finances because your wife didn't want the responsibility. Is that correct?" "That's correct." "So Emily had no involvement in the accounts, none that mattered." "None that mattered," Rachel repeated softly. "Interesting phrasing. Let me ask you something simpler. In March of last year, did your wife attempt to withdraw money from your joint checking account to pay for her mother's medical care?" A flicker crossed Daniel's face, gone in an instant. "I don't recall the specifics." "You don't recall? Let me help. The withdrawal was declined because the account had been closed. Do you recall closing it?" Victor half rose. "Your Honor, is there a question here?" "There is," Rachel said. "Mr. Whitmore, did you close the joint account without informing your wife 3 days before her mother was scheduled for surgery?" The room went very quiet. Daniel smiled, but it was the smile of a man reaching for something that wasn't there. "I restructured our accounts for financial efficiency. The timing was coincidental." "Coincidental," Rachel said. "You use that word the way other people use punctuation." She let the small laugh ripple through the gallery before she continued. "No further questions on this point. For now." For now. Those 2 words landed on Daniel like a hand on the back of his neck. He returned to his seat and leaned toward Victor. "What is she doing?" "Fishing," Victor whispered. "She has nothing. Let her fish." But Emily across the room allowed herself one thing she had not allowed herself in 14 years. She let the corner of her mouth lift, just slightly, just enough for Daniel to see it, and it unsettled him more than any question had. That evening, the story of the closed account leaked to the press. By morning, the headlines had shifted just a fraction from "Billionaire Betrayed" toward "Billionaire's Bitter Battle." Daniel called Victor at 6 in the morning, furious. "You told me there would be no surprises." "That wasn't a surprise, that was a paper cut. Calm down." "She knew about the account, Victor. She knew the exact date. Who's feeding her information?" There was a pause on the line. "Daniel, is there anyone in your circle who might be talking to her? A friend? An employee? A partner?" Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "Marcus, no. Marcus would never. Marcus had too much to lose. They both did." He pushed the thought away, the same way he pushed away every thought that threatened the version of the world he preferred. "No one talks to Emily. Emily doesn't have friends anymore. I made sure of that." He said it like an accomplishment. He didn't hear how it sounded. What Daniel didn't understand was that Emily hadn't needed friends. She had needed one person who would listen without flinching, and she had found her months before the divorce in the office of a lawyer everyone said she couldn't afford. The first meeting, Emily had walked in with a shoebox full of papers and shaking hands and had said, "I don't have money to pay you. He controls all of it. But I have proof. I have everything. I've been writing it down for years and no one ever believed me. And I'm so tired of no one believing me." Rachel Morgan had looked at that shoebox for a long moment. Then she had said, "Show me." And Emily had shown her. Bank statements photographed in secret. Text messages screenshotted before they were deleted. A private notebook filled with dates and dollar amounts and the exact words Daniel had used to make her feel small. Rachel had gone through it page by page, and at some point she had stopped taking notes and simply started reading, and when she finished, she looked up and said something Emily would never forget. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been doing this for 12 years. Most people who come to me have hurt feelings. You have a case. And more than that, you have the one thing that scares men like your husband more than anything else. You have a record. Now let's find out how deep it goes." That was the day everything changed, though Daniel would not know it for weeks. Back in the present, on the third day of the trial, Daniel decided to change his strategy. If Rachel was going to poke at the finances, he would drown the courtroom in emotion. He would remind everyone that he was the victim. "Your Honor," Victor announced, "we'd like to call a witness to Mr. Whitmore's character, his longtime friend and business associate, Mr. Marcus Reed." Emily's fingers went still. Rachel leaned toward her and whispered, "Are you all right?" "He's calling Marcus." Emily breathed. "Rachel, if Marcus testifies, he'll lie. He'll lie for Daniel the way he's lied for years." Rachel's expression didn't change, but there was a new brightness in her eyes. "Good," she whispered back. "Let him. A liar under oath is the most useful thing a courtroom can have." Marcus Reed took the stand. He was a large, comfortable man, the kind who laughed easily and shook hands like he meant it. He described Daniel as loyal, generous, and heartbroken. He described Emily with what he clearly thought was gentle regret as a woman who lost her way. "I watched Daniel try to hold that marriage together," Marcus said. "It broke him. It broke both of us to see it." Victor sat down satisfied. Rachel rose. "Mr. Reed, you and Mr. Whitmore have been business partners for 19 years. Is that right?" "That's right." "You trust each other?" "With everything." "With everything," Rachel echoed, and she let the words hang. "Mr. Reed, in the past 18 months, did Mr. Whitmore transfer any funds to any company associated with you?" Marcus shifted. "We have many business dealings. I can't recall every transfer." "I'm not asking about every transfer. I'm asking about one company. A company registered 14 months ago. A company with no employees, no products, and no address other than a mailbox. Does the name Coastline Holdings mean anything to you?" The color left Marcus Reed's face so quickly that even the reporters noticed. "I would need to consult my records," Marcus said. "I'm sure you would," said Rachel. "No further questions. For now." "For now." Again, those two words. Daniel felt them land in his stomach like cold water. He turned and looked at Marcus. And Marcus looked back at him, and in that single glance, past 19 years of a secret that had just been spoken aloud in a courtroom full of reporters. At the recess, Daniel cornered Victor in the hallway. "How does she know about Coastline?" "Coastline is nothing," Victor said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "It's a holding company, perfectly legal." "It's not the legality I'm worried about," Daniel snapped and then stopped himself because he had said too much even to his own lawyer. He forced his voice level. "Find out how she's getting this information. Today." Across the hallway out of earshot, Emily stood beside Rachel and watched her husband unravel in small private ways, and she felt none of the triumph she had once imagined she would feel. She felt something quieter and heavier and more real. She felt like a woman finally being seen. "Rachel," she said softly, "he's scared." "He should be." "I've never seen him scared. In 14 years, I never once saw him afraid of anything." Rachel looked at her client with something close to tenderness. "That's because for 14 years, Emily, he only ever stood across from people who were more afraid than he was. You're not that person anymore. He just hasn't realized it yet." Emily thought about that. She thought about the first time Daniel had made her feel small at a dinner party in the second year of their marriage, when she had laughed too loudly at a joke, and he had put his hand on her knee under the table and squeezed until it hurt and murmured, You're embarrassing yourself." She thought about how she had spent the next 12 years watching her own laughter, watching her own words, watching herself shrink and shrink until she barely took up any room at all. And then she thought about the shoebox, about every night she had waited until Daniel was asleep to write down what had happened that day, about how even at her smallest, some stubborn part of her had refused to disappear entirely. Some part of her had kept a record. Some part of her had known, even when she couldn't admit it, that the truth was worth keeping. "He always said I was too emotional to understand money," Emily said quietly. "He said it so many times I started to believe it. But I understood it fine, Rachel. I understood it better than he thought. I just never told him." Rachel smiled. "That's the whole strategy, Emily. That's why we're going to win. He built his entire case on the belief that you don't understand anything. Every lie he tells is built on that foundation. And we're going to take that foundation apart one brick at a time until the whole thing falls on his head." When the trial resumed, Victor tried to steer things back to safer ground. He asked Daniel about the emotional toll of the marriage. He asked about sleepless nights. He asked about the pain of watching a loved one change. Daniel answered every question with practiced sorrow, but something in him had shifted. The performance had a crack in it now. He kept glancing at Rachel. He kept waiting for the next "for now." And Rachel, patient as ever, gave him nothing. She let him sweat. She asked one or two harmless questions and sat down, and the not knowing tortured Daniel more than any attack could have. That night, alone in the penthouse, Daniel did something he had not done in years. He went into his home office, closed the door, and sat in the dark. He thought about all the things Rachel had mentioned. The closed account, Coastline Holdings, the transfers, each one was true. Each one was something he thought was buried too deep to ever surface. And yet Emily had them. Emily, who couldn't understand money. Emily, who apologized for noticing the color of the sky. For the first time, a terrible question entered his mind. What else does she have? He picked up the phone and called Marcus. "We need to talk," Daniel said. "We need to stop talking," Marcus shot back, and there was fear in his voice now, real fear. "Do you understand what happened today? She named Coastline, in open court, in front of reporters. If they start pulling that thread, Daniel, it doesn't stop at the divorce. It goes all the way down. You know what's at the bottom of that. So do I." "She doesn't have anything real," Daniel said, but he didn't believe it anymore. "You keep saying that, and every day she has more. Where is it coming from, Daniel? You told me she was isolated. You told me she had nothing. So how does a woman with nothing walk into court with the account closure dates and the shell company names?" Daniel had no answer, and the silence on the line was worse than any accusation. He hung up without saying goodbye and sat in the dark a long time. And in that darkness, he began for the very first time to be afraid of his own wife. What he still did not understand, what he would not understand for a while yet, was the depth of what Emily had built. Because Emily had not simply kept a record. In the months before Daniel filed for divorce, sensing what was coming, she had done something quietly astonishing. She had gone to Rachel, and Rachel had brought in a forensic financial investigator named Harold Kim, a soft-spoken man with an unforgiving eye for numbers. And together, the three of them had spent night after night mapping the entire architecture of Daniel's deception. They had followed the money out of the joint accounts and into Coastline. They had followed it out of Coastline and into 3 more companies, each thinner and emptier than the last. They had watched millions of dollars vanish from the marriage and reappear cleaned and disguised in places Daniel thought no one would ever look. And Harold Kim, going through it line by line, had begun to notice something that had nothing to do with the divorce at all. He had begun to notice that the same tricks Daniel used to hide money from his wife looked remarkably like the tricks a man might use to hide money from investors, and from regulators, and from the government. "Emily," Harold had said one night, taking off his glasses and rubbing his eyes, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand the weight of it. Do you want to win a divorce, or do you want the truth to come out completely?" Emily had thought about it for a long time. She had thought about all the years she had swallowed the truth to keep the peace. She had thought about how much smaller she had become each time she had chosen silence. "I want the truth," she had said finally. "All of it, even the parts that scare me." "You understand what that means," Harold said. If this goes where I think it goes, it's not just a divorce anymore. It's federal. It's Marcus, too. It's people we haven't even identified yet. Once it starts, you can't control where it lands." "He never let me control anything," Emily said quietly. "For 14 years, he controlled everything. Maybe it's time to let the truth control it instead." Rachel had reached across the table and put her hand over Emily's. "Then we do it right. We don't tip our hand. We let him feel safe. We let him testify. We let him lie under oath again and again, because every lie he tells becomes a weight around his own neck. And when the moment is right, we show the court exactly who he is. Not with our words, with his." "With his?" Emily had asked. "Emily." Rachel had smiled then the way a card player smiles when she's holding the one card no one at the table knows exists. "Emily, tell me again about the security system in his home office." And Emily had told her. About the private cameras Daniel had installed years ago, obsessed as he was with security, convinced everyone was out to steal from him. About how those cameras recorded everything, audio included, and saved it all to a server. About how Daniel, so certain that no one could touch his private world, had never once imagined that the account he'd set up in Emily's name, back when he still pretended to trust her, still gave her access to every file on that server. Rachel had gone very still. "Emily, are you telling me there are recordings of him talking?" "There are recordings of everything," Emily had said. "He forgot they existed. He forgot I existed too, in a way. That's the thing about being invisible, Rachel. People say things in front of you they'd never say in front of anyone who matters, and they never think you're listening. But that card, that terrible and perfect card, was still weeks away from being played. On the 4th day of the trial, all Daniel knew was that his wife had questions he couldn't answer and knowledge she shouldn't have, and that the ground beneath his beautiful life had begun to feel less like stone and more like ice. He tried to regain control the only way he knew how, through fear. During the lunch recess on the 4th day, he found a way to be alone with Emily for 30 seconds in a corridor, and he used them. He leaned close, his voice low and pleasant, the same voice he'd used for 14 years to make her doubt her own mind. "You think you're clever," he said. "You think that lawyer of yours is going to save you. But I know things about you, Emily. I know how fragile you are. One more push and you'll fall apart in that courtroom, just like you always did at home. And everyone will see exactly what I've been telling them, that you're unwell, that you can't be trusted. So here's my advice, sweetheart. Take the settlement, take nothing, and be grateful before I show them the real you." And here is where Daniel made his final fatal mistake, because the woman he was threatening was not the woman he remembered. He was speaking to a ghost that no longer existed, a version of Emily he had killed himself over years without ever noticing she had come back to life. Emily looked at him. She did not shrink. She did not apologize. She did not glance away. "You know things about me," she said quietly. "That's true, Daniel. You know a lot of things about me." She let a small, sad smile touch her lips. "But you never once bothered to learn the most important thing." "And what's that?" he sneered. "That I was listening," she said, "the whole time, for 14 years, every word. I was listening." And she walked past him back into the courtroom, leaving him standing in the corridor with a cold feeling spreading through his chest that he could not name and could not stop. He watched her go. And for the first time in his adult life, Daniel Whitmore felt like the person at the disadvantage. He felt suddenly and completely like a man who had walked into a room he thought he owned, only to discover that someone had quietly changed the locks years ago and never told him. When the trial resumed that afternoon, Rachel Morgan rose and addressed the court in a voice that was calm and clear and utterly without mercy. "Your Honor, over the coming days, the defense intends to present a picture of Mr. Whitmore as a wronged and generous husband. We intend to present a very different picture. We intend to show that the financial irresponsibility Mr. Whitmore accuses his wife of was in fact his own, that the emotional instability he describes was in fact a campaign of deliberate control, and that beneath this divorce lies a far larger set of facts that this court and possibly other authorities will need to consider very carefully. We are not asking the court to take our word for any of it. We're going to let Mr. Whitmore's own records, his own transactions, and in time, his own words tell the story. We ask only for the court's patience while we lay the foundation." Daniel felt Victor stiffen beside him. He heard the reporters behind him begin to murmur. He looked across the courtroom at Emily, who sat with her hands folded, calm as still water, and he realized far too late that he had spent the entire trial fighting the wrong battle. He had come to destroy a broken woman. He had not understood that the broken woman was gone, and in her place sat someone who had spent months learning exactly how his empire was built and exactly which single thread, when pulled, would bring the whole thing down. Judge Reyes looked over her glasses at the defense table. "Mr. Caldwell, does your client wish to reconsider his position on settlement before we proceed?" Victor leaned toward Daniel and whispered urgently, "Take a recess. Let me think. This is going somewhere I don't like." But Daniel Whitmore had never in his life backed down from anyone, and pride is a stubborn thing that outlives good sense. "No," he said loud enough for the room to hear. "We proceed. Let her present whatever fantasy she's invented. I have nothing to hide." The words came out strong, but Emily, watching him, saw the tiny tremor in his hand as he said them, and she knew in that moment that the man who had spent 14 years teaching her to doubt herself had just made the last confident decision he would ever make in that courtroom. Rachel gathered her papers. She glanced at Emily, and Emily gave her the smallest nod. "Very well, Your Honor," Rachel said. "Then with the court's permission, we'll begin laying that foundation now. The defense wants to talk about who wasted money in this marriage. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about all of it. Starting with a company called Coastline Holdings and the $412,000 that moved through it in a single month, none of which appears in any tax filing Mr. Whitmore submitted to this court." The murmur in the gallery swelled into something louder. A reporter in the back stood up and slipped out to make a call. Daniel felt the room turning, felt the story rewriting itself in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had built his whole life on being the one who controlled the story. And now, for the first time, the story belonged to Emily. She sat straight in her chair, her chin level, her eyes clear, a woman the world had been told to pity, watching the beginning of the end of the man who had tried to erase her. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply watched and listened, the way she had always listened, the way he had never once imagined could be dangerous. Because somewhere on a server, Daniel had forgotten existed in a file he had never thought to delete. There was a recording of a confident man in his private office speaking words he believed no one would ever hear. And when the moment was right, when the foundation was laid and the room was ready, Emily was going to let the whole world hear them. But not yet. Not yet. For now she folded her hands, met her husband's frightened eyes across the courtroom, and let the silence do what silence does best. She let it tell him without a single word that everything he thought he knew about the woman he married had been wrong from the very beginning. And in the front row of the gallery, Marcus Reed sat with sweat on his forehead and his hands clasped too tightly in his lap, staring at the back of Daniel's head, thinking about Coastline, thinking about the recordings he didn't yet know existed, thinking about how a divorce he'd been told was already won had somehow become the most dangerous room he had ever sat in. The judge called for the first financial exhibit to be entered into evidence. Emily Whitmore closed her eyes for one brief moment, and in the darkness behind them she saw every night she had spent writing the truth by hand while the man beside her slept, certain of his own safety. Then she opened them, and she was ready. The first financial exhibit landed on the courtroom screen like a stone through glass. Rows of numbers, dates, transfers, all of it pulled from Daniel Whitmore's own accounts, and every person in the gallery leaned forward to read them. Rachel Morgan let them look. She had learned long ago that the most powerful thing a lawyer could do was step back and let the truth speak for itself. "Your Honor," Rachel said, "this document shows $412,000 moving out of a marital account and into Coastline Holdings over a period of 31 days. Mr. Whitmore has testified under oath that he managed the household finances responsibly and transparently. I'd like to ask him to explain this transaction." Daniel rose to return to the stand, and for the first time in the trial his walk was different. Slower, more careful, like a man testing the floor before he put his weight on it. Victor Caldwell leaned over and whispered fast and low, "Keep it simple. Business investment. Legal restructuring. Don't elaborate. The more you say, the more she has to work with." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't really listening. His eyes were on Emily. She sat with that same maddening stillness, and he kept waiting for the crack in her, the tremble, the flicker of the frightened woman he had lived with for 14 years. It wasn't there, and its absence was driving him quietly out of his mind. He took the oath again. He sat. "Mr. Whitmore," Rachel began, "what is Coastline Holdings?" "An investment vehicle," Daniel said smoothly. "A holding company. I use it to manage certain assets. It's completely legal." "I didn't ask if it was legal," Rachel said. "I asked what it is, but I'm glad you brought up legality. We'll come back to it." A ripple moved through the gallery. "You said you use it to manage assets. What assets?" "Various investments. Name one." Daniel paused. It was half a second, no more, but in a courtroom, half a second is a canyon. "I'd have to review the records. You moved $400,000 into this company, and you can't name a single thing it holds. I have many companies, Ms. Morgan. I can't recite every detail from memory." "Of course not," Rachel said pleasantly. "That's what records are for. Let's look at them together." She turned to the screen. "This is Coastline's filing from last year. Employees 0. Physical office none. Products or services none listed. Bank activity $412,000 in and $412,000 out, all within the same month, to 3 other companies that look remarkably similar. No employees, no offices, no products. Mr. Whitmore, do you know what a court calls a company like that?" "Objection," Victor barked, rising. "Counsel is testifying." "Sustained. Ask a question, Ms. Morgan." "Gladly. Mr. Whitmore, where did the $412,000 go after it left Coastline?" And there it was, the question Daniel could not answer without lying, and could not lie about safely because Rachel already had the records. He knew she had them. That was the trap. She never asked a question she didn't already know the answer to. "Into other investments," he said. "Which ones?" "I've told you I'd have to review the files." "Then let me review them for you." Rachel clicked to the next slide, and the murmur in the gallery rose again. 200,000 of it landed in a company registered to an address in the Cayman Islands. Another 150,000 went to a firm that dissolved 6 weeks after receiving it. The remaining 62,000 was withdrawn as cash. "Mr. Whitmore, does any of this appear on the financial disclosures you submitted to this court under penalty of perjury?" Silence. "I'll take your silence as a no," Rachel said, "because I've read every page of your disclosures and none of this is in them." Daniel's jaw tightened. It was an oversight. "An oversight," Rachel repeated, and she let the phrase sit in the air until it started to sound absurd. $412,000 moving through 4 companies across 2 countries was an oversight. At the defense table, Victor closed his eyes for a brief moment, the way a man does when he watches a car he can't stop rolling toward a wall. In the gallery, a reporter typed so fast, his phone nearly slipped out of his hands. Another one was already whispering into a call. And in the front row, Marcus Reed had gone the color of old paper. Because 2 of those 4 companies had his fingerprints on them too, and he knew it, and he was beginning to understand that Daniel could not go down without dragging him along. Rachel glanced at the clock. It was 2:10. She had exactly the pace she wanted. "No further questions on Coastline," she said. "For now." For now. The words hit Daniel like they always did, and this time he actually flinched. He returned to the defense table and sat, and under the table his hands were not steady. "What is she doing?" he whispered to Victor. "She keeps stopping. Why does she keep stopping?" "Because she's not trying to win the divorce," Victor whispered back, and for the first time there was something like fear in the old lawyer's voice. "Daniel, listen to me. A divorce lawyer trying to win a settlement attacks the character. She's not attacking your character. She's building a record. She's laying every transaction out one by one cleanly on the record in front of the press. That's not what you do to win a divorce. That's what you do when you're handing a file to someone else." Daniel felt the blood leave his face. "Someone else." "The government, Daniel. She's building a case for the government." The recess couldn't come fast enough. When the judge finally called it, Daniel practically pulled Victor into an empty conference room and shut the door. "You need to end this," Daniel said. "Settle. Give her whatever she wants. Make it stop before she gets to the rest of it." Victor stared at him. "Before she gets to the rest of what, Daniel? What rest you keep saying that? You told me there was nothing else. If you're hiding something from your own attorney, I cannot protect you. I need to know what she knows before she knows it, and right now she is 3 moves ahead of me on every single thing. So I'll ask you one time, and I need the truth. What else is there?" And Daniel, the man who had lied so easily and so often for so many years, that lying had become as natural as breathing, opened his mouth to lie again and found he couldn't, not to the one person standing between him and disaster. "There are things at the company," he said finally quietly. "Reports that were adjusted, numbers that were moved to make certain quarters look better than they were, investors who were shown one set of figures while the real set stayed private." Victor sat down slowly. He suddenly looked much older. "How much?" "Enough." "How much, Daniel?" "Enough that if it comes out, it isn't a divorce and it isn't a fine. It's prison. For me and for Marcus, and for 2 people on my board who signed things they were told were routine." For a long moment, Victor said nothing at all. Then he spoke, and his voice was flat and final. "Then you should have taken the first settlement she offered and walked away quietly, and you never should have let this go to open court. You wanted to humiliate her, Daniel. You wanted the cameras. You wanted the world to watch you destroy her. And now the world is watching. It's just not watching the story you planned." Daniel had no answer. Because it was true, all of it. He had chosen the public trial. He had insisted on it. He had wanted Emily's ruin to be a spectacle. And now, the spectacle was his. Out in the hallway, Emily stood with Rachel and Harold Kim, the forensic investigator, reviewing the afternoon's plan in low voices. "He's rattled," Harold said. "I've watched a lot of men on the stand. He's past rattled. He's into the part where they start making mistakes." "Good," Rachel said. "But we don't rush. We've been over this. The recordings are the last thing, not the first. We establish every fact on paper first so that when the recording plays, it doesn't sound like a trick. It sounds like a confirmation. The jury of public opinion out there needs to already believe it before they hear him say it. Then the recording isn't a surprise. It's the nail in a coffin they already built." Emily nodded, but her mind was somewhere else. "He threatened me again, during the last recess." Rachel turned sharply. "What did he say?" "The same thing he always says, that he'll show everyone the real me, that I'm fragile, that one more push and I'll fall apart." Emily's voice was steady, but her hands had curled into fists at her sides. 14 years, Rachel. 14 years of that exact sentence. And you know what I realized standing there? It doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't work. He said the words, and I waited to feel small the way I always did, and the feeling never came. Rachel put a hand on her shoulder. "That's because it was never true. It was just something he said often enough that you started keeping it for him. You've been carrying his lie about you for 14 years. You can put it down now." Emily's eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. "I want to put it down. I do. But there's a part of me, Rachel, this small, terrible part, that still hears his voice and believes it, that still wonders if he's right. If I am the thing he says I am." Harold, who rarely spoke about anything but numbers, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, can I say something?" She nodded. "I've spent 4 months inside your husband's finances, every hidden account, every shell company, every trick, and I want to tell you something about the woman who first walked into Miss Morgan's office with a shoebox. The reason we caught all of it, the reason any of this is possible, is that for years, while that man was telling you that you were too foolish to understand money, you were quietly documenting the most sophisticated financial fraud I've encountered in a decade. A confused woman doesn't do that. A fragile woman doesn't do that. So whatever his voice tells you, the record tells the opposite. And I trust the record." For a moment, Emily couldn't speak. Then she said softly, "Thank you. I don't think anyone's ever said anything like that to me before." "Well," Harold said a little awkwardly, "they should have." The recess ended. They filed back in. It was 20 to 3. When the trial resumed, Rachel changed direction, and the shift was so smooth that the gallery didn't see it coming. She stopped talking about companies. She started talking about a marriage. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you testified that your wife was financially irresponsible, that she spent money the two of you didn't discuss. Do you stand by that?" "I do," Daniel said. He was on firmer ground here, or he thought he was. This was the story he'd told 1,000 times. Emily spent constantly. She never consulted me. "Can you give the court an example?" There were many. "One will do," Daniel thought. "She spent thousands on her mother's medical care without discussing it with me." And Rachel smiled because he had walked exactly where she wanted him. Her mother's medical care. Let's talk about that. Mr. Whitmore, wasn't that the very same medical care she was trying to pay for in March when she went to withdraw money and discovered you had closed the account 3 days before her mother's surgery? The gallery stirred. "I closed the account for financial reasons," Daniel said. "I've explained that." "You have. What you haven't explained is this." Rachel put a new document on the screen. "This is a text message you sent to Marcus Reed on the 14th of February, 1 month before you closed that account. Would you read the highlighted line to the court?" Daniel's eyes moved across the screen, and the room watched the exact moment they stopped. "Objection," Victor said, but it came out weak. "On what grounds?" Judge Reyes asked. Victor had none. "Withdrawn." "Read it, Mr. Whitmore," Rachel said gently. Daniel's voice, when it came, was very quiet. "It says, going to close the joint account before the surgery. Let her feel what it's like to have nothing. She'll come crawling back and sign whatever I want." The courtroom made a sound Emily had never heard before, a kind of collective intake of breath, dozens of people reacting to the same thing at the same time. And Emily, who had lived that day, who had stood at that bank counter with a declined card and a mother scheduled for surgery, and a terror she could barely breathe through, felt something crack open in her chest, not grief, something closer to release, because for the first time, the thing that had happened to her in private was happening in public, and everyone could see it, and no one could tell her it wasn't real. "You planned it," Rachel said quietly. "The account closure. It wasn't financial restructuring, it was a weapon. You timed it to your wife's mother's surgery so that your wife would be desperate so that she would, in your own words, come crawling back and sign whatever you wanted. Is that a fair reading of your message, Mr. Whitmore?" Daniel said nothing. "Your Honor," Rachel said, "let the record reflect the witness declines to answer." It was 3:05. Rachel had timed it perfectly. She let that sit. Then she pushed forward faster, now the pace picking up, because she could feel the room turning fully against him, and she intended to use every ounce of that momentum. "Let's talk about the reputation," she said. "You testified that your wife became paranoid and unstable. You told friends she was under a lot of stress. You built a picture over years of a woman losing her grip. Mr. Whitmore, did you ever tell anyone that your wife was mentally unwell when you did not believe that to be true?" "I was concerned about her," Daniel said. "That's not what I asked. Did you ever say she was unwell, knowing she was not, in order to protect yourself?" "No." "No," Rachel repeated. "Let's test that." Another message on the screen. "Also to Mr. Reed, also last year. If she talks to anyone about the accounts we say she's paranoid, everyone already thinks she's fragile. I made sure of that. No one will believe her over me." "But," Rachel turned to face him fully, "you made sure of that. You engineered a reputation of fragility for your own wife deliberately so that if she ever told the truth, no one would believe her. Those are your words, Mr. Whitmore, do you deny writing them?" Daniel's mouth opened, closed. In the front row, Marcus Reed had begun to shake his head slowly, not in denial, but in something like despair, because every message Rachel put on that screen was a message he had received, which meant every message was a thread that led straight back to him. "I want to consult with my attorney," Daniel said. "Of course," Rachel said. "But before you do, I'd like the court and the gallery to sit with what we've just learned. This man told this court his wife was unstable, and we now have his own words in his own hand admitting that he manufactured that story to discredit her in advance. Every single thing he has said about her character on that stand was built on a lie he planned in writing. I'd ask the court to keep that in mind as we continue." Judge Reyes looked at Daniel over her glasses for a long, cold moment. We'll take a brief recess. Mr. Caldwell, I suggest you use it well." Daniel and Victor disappeared into the conference room again, and this time the door didn't fully muffle the sound of raised voices. Emily couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. She'd heard Daniel angry through walls for 14 years. She knew the exact pitch of it, the way it climbed when he felt cornered, the way it dropped into something cold and dangerous when he stopped shouting and started scheming. "He's planning something," she said to Rachel. "Let him. He's out of good moves. Everything he does now is damage control, and damage control in front of cameras only makes it worse. Every time he opens his mouth, he digs the hole deeper. The best thing that can happen to us is Daniel Whitmore deciding to be clever." But Emily knew Daniel in a way Rachel didn't. She knew that when he was truly cornered, he didn't get careful. He got vicious. And a vicious Daniel was capable of things a careful one never would be. She was right to worry. When the trial resumed at 20-4, Victor Caldwell rose with a new expression on his face. He had clearly made a decision, and Emily's stomach tightened because she recognized it. It was the look of a man about to do something ugly because he'd run out of clean options. "Your Honor," Victor said, "the defense would like to call a witness. Dr. Alan Feld, a psychiatrist who evaluated Mrs. Whitmore 2 years ago." The room shifted. Emily's breath caught. Rachel's head turned slowly toward her client, a silent question in her eyes, and Emily gave the smallest shake of her head. She didn't know about this. She hadn't been evaluated. "Had she, Your Honor?" Rachel said, standing, "We have received no notice of this witness, no report, no records of any evaluation. This is the first we're hearing of it." "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said. "The evaluation was informal, Your Honor. A dinner and observation. Dr. Feld is a longtime friend of Mr. Whitmore's and a licensed professional. He observed Mrs. Whitmore's behavior over a period of time and formed concerns. We believe his testimony is relevant to her stability and credibility." And now Emily understood exactly what Daniel had done, and it turned her cold. There had been a dinner 2 years ago. A man she'd met once briefly who'd asked her a few strange questions she hadn't understood at the time. Daniel had set it up. Daniel had planted a psychiatrist at a dinner table to build a file on his own wife, a file he was now trying to spring on her in open court, and the cruelty of it, the sheer patient calculation of it, took her breath away. Rachel was already moving. "Your Honor, this is precisely the conduct we've been describing all afternoon. Mr. Whitmore's own text messages entered into evidence state that he deliberately built a reputation of fragility around his wife to discredit her. And now, in the same trial, the defense produces a friend of Mr. Whitmore's posing as a neutral observer to do exactly what those messages describe. This is not evidence. This is the crime itself happening live in this courtroom." The gallery murmured its agreement, but Victor pressed on because he had nothing else. "Dr. Feld is a licensed psychiatrist," he repeated. "His professional opinion is admissible." "His professional opinion," Rachel said, "was formed at a dinner party arranged by the man paying his fee without the knowledge or consent of the person being evaluated. Your Honor, if the court allows this, it endorses exactly the manipulation we're here to expose." Judge Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll allow limited testimony and I'll allow Ms. Morgan full cross-examination. But Mr. Caldwell, I'll warn you now. If this witness turns out to be what Ms. Morgan suggests, it will not help your client. It may do the opposite." Victor swallowed. But the play was in motion now, and he called Dr. Alan Feld to the stand. Feld was a smooth, well-dressed man, comfortable with attention. He testified that he'd observed Mrs. Whitmore on several social occasions, and that she'd exhibited what he called signs of emotional dysregulation and possible paranoia. He said it clinically calmly, and to someone who didn't know the truth, it might have sounded convincing. Then Rachel stood and the temperature in the room dropped. "Dr. Feld, how many times have you met my client?" "Several social occasions." "How many? A number, please." A pause. "2, perhaps." "2. And in those 2 social occasions, did you ever identify yourself to her as a psychiatrist, conducting any kind of evaluation?" "It wasn't a formal evaluation." "That's not what I asked. Did she know she was being observed by a psychiatrist?" "Not explicitly." "Not explicitly, so she didn't know." Rachel let that land. "Dr. Feld, how long have you known Daniel Whitmore?" "Some years." How many? Perhaps 20. 20 years. And in those 20 years, has Mr. Whitmore ever invested in any of your professional ventures? Feld hesitated, and the hesitation was an answer. He has been a supporter of my clinic. A supporter? How much has Mr. Whitmore contributed to your clinic over the years, Doctor? I don't have an exact figure. I do. Rachel put a document on the screen. $1.1 million over 8 years. Would you say a man who has given you $1.1 million is a friend, Dr. Feld, or an employer? Objection, Victor said, but there was no strength left in it. Overruled. Doctor, Rachel continued, relentless now. You diagnosed a woman you met twice at parties without her knowledge or consent, with paranoia on behalf of a man who has paid you over $1 million in a trial where that man is trying to prove his wife is unstable. Is that a fair summary of your testimony here today? Feld's composure was gone. You're twisting it. I'm reading it back to you. Which part is untwisted? He had no answer. No further questions, Rachel said, and she turned away from him as if he were no longer worth looking at. Your Honor, I'd ask the court to strike Dr. Feld's testimony in its entirety, and I'd ask the court to consider it not as evidence about my client, but as evidence about her husband. Because we have now watched in real time exactly the mechanism Mr. Whitmore described in his own text messages. He builds the reputation. He pays the expert. He springs the trap. This is who he is. And Emily Whitmore has lived inside this machine for 14 years. The words hung in the air. And Emily, sitting at the table, realized that she was crying silently, not from pain, but from something she had no name for. It was the feeling of a truth she had held alone for so long, finally at last being held by an entire room. Judge Reyes removed her glasses. Dr. Feld, you may step down. His testimony is stricken. Mr. Caldwell, I gave you a warning, and you proceeded anyway. I want the record to reflect the court's serious concern about the conduct of the defense in this matter. Victor sat. He did not look at his client. Daniel, for his part, had stopped performing entirely. There was no wounded husband on his face anymore, no patient victim. There was just a man watching every wall he'd built get pulled down one at a time and beginning to understand, truly understand, that he was not going to walk out of this the way he came in. He leaned toward Victor. The recordings, he whispered so quietly that only Victor could hear. Does she have the recordings? Victor turned to look at him. What recordings, Daniel? And Daniel realized with a fresh wave of cold horror that he had just said too much again. Because Victor didn't know about the recordings. No one knew about the recordings, except Daniel, and he was beginning to fear one other person. He turned slowly and looked across the courtroom at his wife. Emily was already looking at him. Her cheeks were wet, but her eyes were steady, and there was something in them he had never seen before in 14 years of marriage. Not fear, not apology, not the careful, shrinking watchfulness he had trained into her. Something else entirely. Something that looked almost like pity. She knew. He didn't know how she knew, but he knew that she knew. He could see it in her face as clearly as if she'd said it out loud. Somewhere in the world there was a recording of him in his private office, believing himself completely safe, saying things he could never take back. And Emily had it, and she was going to use it. The clock read 4:15. Judge Reyes gathered her papers. It's late, and it's been an eventful afternoon. We'll adjourn until tomorrow morning. Ms. Morgan, I take it the plaintiff intends to continue presenting evidence. Rachel stood. We do, Your Honor. And with the court's permission tomorrow, we'll be presenting a piece of evidence that I believe will make the nature of this case unmistakably clear. I'll allow it. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down and the room erupted into motion. Reporters scrambling for the doors, phones already at their ears, the story of the day pouring out into the world faster than anyone could contain it. Daniel didn't move. He sat at the defense table while the courtroom emptied around him, staring straight ahead, and for the first time since the trial began, he felt the full weight of what was coming. Not the divorce. The divorce was already lost, and he knew it. It was the other thing, the thing at the bottom of the thread Rachel kept pulling. Coastline and the companies beneath it, and the adjusted reports, and Marcus and the board members and the investors, and the recording. The recording that would take all of it, every hidden piece, and drag it into the light where the whole world could see. Victor stood gathering his files and paused beside his client. "Daniel," he said quietly, "whatever is on that recording, I need to know tonight, because if it's what I think it is, this stopped being a case I can win a long time ago. The only thing left to decide is how much of your life you get to keep. Do you understand me?" Daniel didn't answer. He was still watching the doors his wife had walked through. Across town in Rachel Morgan's office, Emily sat with Rachel and Harold as the evening light faded the three of them around a small table, the server file sitting on a laptop between them unopened. "Tomorrow," Rachel said. "You're sure you want to do this? Once it plays, there's no taking it back. It goes everywhere, every network, every phone. His life ends in that room. Emily and I need you to be certain that's what you want and that you're ready for what comes after." Emily looked at the laptop for a long time. She thought about the bank counter and the declined card. She thought about the dinner with a stranger who turned out to be a spy. She thought about 14 years of a voice telling her she was fragile, foolish, unwell, until she'd nearly believed it herself. And she thought about the man in that recording, so confident, so certain no one was listening, saying the words that would finally set her free. "I spent 14 years being told the truth about me didn't matter," she said quietly. "That no one would believe me, that I was too small to be heard." She looked up at Rachel, and her eyes were clear and dry now, and completely certain. "Tomorrow, the whole world is going to listen, and they're going to believe me. Not because of anything I say, because of everything he said when he thought no one could hear." She reached out and closed the laptop with a soft click. "Play it tomorrow," she said. "Play all of it." Daniel Whitmore did not sleep that night. He sat in his home office until dawn in the very room where the cameras had been recording him for years, and he tried to remember every word he had ever spoken inside those walls. There were too many. That was the horror of it. A man who believes he is safe says everything. He confesses without knowing he is confessing. He plans out loud. He laughs at people who cannot hear him. And somewhere in that endless archive of his own arrogance was the conversation that would finish him, and he could not even remember exactly what he had said, only that he had said it, only that Emily had it. By the time the gray light came through the windows, he had made a decision. He would not let it play. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, he would keep that recording out of the courtroom. He called Marcus at 6 a.m. "You need to come to court today," Daniel said. "Are you out of your mind?" Marcus's voice was ragged, torn up from lack of sleep. "After yesterday, after she put Coastline on a screen in front of 40 reporters, I'm not coming anywhere near that building, Daniel. My lawyer told me to stay home and keep my mouth shut. She has a recording, Marcus." The silence on the line was long and terrible. "A recording of what?" Marcus said finally, and his voice had changed. The fatigue was gone. Something colder had replaced it. "From my office, from the security system. I don't know exactly what's on it, but if it's the conversation I think it is, it's not the divorce anymore. It's the reports. It's the investors. It's you." Daniel heard Marcus's breathing change on the other end. Fast, shallow. "You told me those cameras were locked down. You told me you were the only one who could ever access that system. You swore it to me, Daniel. You sat across from me and you swore it." "Emily had access," Daniel said, and saying it out loud made it worse, made it real. "I set it up years ago, when I still trusted her. I put her name on the account and I forgot. I forgot she was even on it." "You forgot?" Marcus laughed, a horrible sound with nothing human in it. "You forgot your own wife. You spent so many years pretending she was furniture that you forgot she was a person with a password. And now she's holding a knife to both our throats because you couldn't be bothered to remember she existed." He went quiet, and when he spoke again, the calculation was back cold and precise. "How do we stop it?" "Victor thinks we can get it excluded. If we argue it was obtained illegally, the judge might not allow it into evidence." "Was it obtained illegally?" Daniel closed his eyes. This was the question. This was the whole thing. "No. She had legal access to the account. That's the problem. There's no illegal act. She just opened a door I gave her the key to." Another silence. And then Marcus said the thing that had been sitting between the two of them for 19 years, unspoken, poisonous patient. "Daniel, if this comes out, I am not going down alone. I want that clear, Right now, this morning, before either of us walks into anything. If I go to prison, you go first, and you go longer, because it was your company and your idea and your voice giving the orders. And I have kept everything, every email, every instruction. Every time you told me to move a number, I saved it. Because some part of me always knew a morning like this one was coming. So do not for 1 second think about handing me over to save your own skin. Do you understand me? And Daniel understood with a nausea that rose from somewhere deep in his gut that the one man he had trusted for 19 years had been quietly preparing to destroy him for just as long, exactly as Daniel had been preparing to destroy Marcus, if it ever came to that. They were not partners. They had never been partners. They were two men who had spent 2 decades holding loaded weapons to each other's heads, and they had simply agreed to call it friendship because the truth was too ugly to look at. "Just come to court," Daniel said. "We stop the recording, we keep it out, and then it stays a divorce. Nothing more. We both walk away." He hung up before Marcus could answer because he did not want to hear whether Marcus believed him. He was not sure he believed himself. At 9 o'clock, the courtroom was fuller than it had been on any previous day of the trial. Word had gotten out. Every seat in the gallery was taken, and the hallway outside was jammed with reporters who could not get in standing on their toes holding phones over the heads of the people in front of them. Overnight, the story had detonated. The text messages, the closed account timed to a mother's surgery the psychiatrist bought and paid for. All of it had poured out into the world while the city slept, and Daniel Whitmore, the self-made genius, the man the magazines had called untouchable, was trending on every platform in the country. Not the way he was used to. Not at all. Emily arrived quietly, the way she always did. She wore a simple dark suit, and she carried nothing but a small folder held against her chest. Rachel Morgan walked at her side unhurried, and Harold Kim followed a step behind, and the three of them took their places at the plaintiff's table with the calm of people who already knew how the day would end. Daniel arrived and could not look at his wife. He sat at the defense table beside Victor, and beside Victor sat a man who had not been there before, a second lawyer, younger, sharper, with the particular alertness of someone who dealt in criminal matters rather than divorces. Victor had called him overnight, and the mere sight of him at the defense table told the entire gallery how far this thing had traveled from the marriage that had started it. Judge Patricia Reyes took the bench at 9:15, and the room fell silent. "Before we begin," Victor said, rising the instant she was seated, "the defense has an urgent motion, and I would ask the court to hear it before any evidence is presented. It has come to our understanding that the plaintiff intends to introduce an audio or video recording today. We move to exclude it in its entirety. The recording, as we understand it, was captured by a private security system inside Mr. Whitmore's personal home office. It captures private conversations without the knowledge or consent of all parties present. We believe it was obtained improperly, that it violates Mr. Whitmore's reasonable expectation of privacy and the privacy of third parties who had no idea they were being recorded, and that its introduction would be deeply prejudicial." Judge Reyes turned. "Ms. Morgan, respond to the motion." Rachel rose, and she took her time. She had learned long ago that a lawyer who is certain does not rush. "Your Honor, the recording in question was captured by a security system that Mr. Whitmore installed, himself paid for himself, and configured himself. It recorded his own office on his own property at his own direction, capturing his own voice. My client, Emily Whitmore, has held legal authorized and continuous access to that security system server since the day it was installed for one simple reason. Mr. Whitmore added her to the account himself, in both their names, during a period when he apparently still considered her his wife in more than paperwork. She accessed a system she was fully authorized to access. She retrieved a file she was legally entitled to retrieve. There is nothing improper about any of it. The only improper thing that happened, Your Honor, is what Mr. Whitmore chose to say while the system he built was faithfully recording every word. He did not know he was being recorded. Victor pressed, but there was strain in it now. He installed the cameras, Rachel said simply. He knew they captured audio. He knew they ran continuously. He knew the footage was saved to a server. The only thing he did not know, or rather the only thing he forgot, was that the woman he was so busy erasing from his life still held a lawful key to the record of it. That is not a privacy violation, Your Honor. That is a man undone by his own surveillance. If Mr. Whitmore wishes to complain about the cameras in his office, his complaint lies with the man who installed them, and that man is sitting at the defense table in front of you. A low ripple of something like laughter moved through the gallery. Even Judge Reyes's mouth tightened at one corner before she smoothed it away. Victor tried once more. Your Honor, there are third parties on that recording who never consented to being recorded. Their privacy interests, Rachel interrupted gently, will be a matter for them to raise through their own counsel in whatever proceeding may follow. But I would note that a person who walks into another man's private office and voluntarily discusses a criminal scheme has a rather diminished expectation that the conversation is protected. Your Honor, this recording is lawful, it is authenticated, and it goes directly to the character and credibility of a man who has spent this entire trial telling this court a story. I ask that it be admitted. Judge Reyes considered it for a long moment. She looked at the defense table at the criminal specialist in his expensive suit, at Daniel Whitmore with his gray, sleepless face. Then she looked at the plaintiff's table at Emily, who sat with her hands folded and her chin level and her eyes steady, waiting without fear. The motion is denied, the judge said. Mrs. Whitmore held lawful access to the recording. It was captured on Mr. Whitmore's own property by his own equipment of his own voice. Ms. Morgan, you may proceed. Daniel felt the words land somewhere deep in his body, in a place he had not known existed. It was 9:25 in the morning, and his life had just been given a time of death. He leaned toward Victor, and his whisper was barely a breath. Do something. There is nothing to do, Victor whispered back. And for the first time in the entire trial, the old lawyer's voice was not confident. It was the voice of a man watching a building come down and understanding that he is inside it. It's admitted, Daniel. Whatever is on it, it's coming in. All we can do now is listen with everyone else. Your Honor, Rachel said. The plaintiff calls no further witnesses at this stage. Instead, we ask the court's permission to play a recording retrieved from the security server at Mr. Whitmore's residence dated the 9th of November of last year, approximately 8 months before Mr. Whitmore filed for divorce. Proceed. Rachel nodded to Harold, who connected the file to the courtroom system. The large screens that had displayed financial documents all week went dark, waiting. The room fell so quiet that Emily could hear the soft hum of the building's air, her own pulse in her ears, the creak of a chair somewhere in the back, as a reporter leaned forward. Daniel gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. Victor put a hand on his forearm, though whether it was to steady him or to hold him in his seat, even Victor could not have said. The recording began. At first there was only the sound of a room, the soft scrape of a chair, the clink of a glass being set down on wood, and then a voice unmistakably Daniel's, but a Daniel no one in that courtroom had seen, relaxed, warm, amused, the voice of a man alone with a trusted friend speaking freely, believing himself entirely and permanently safe. She still thinks this is a rough patch, the recorded Daniel said, and a low laugh followed. That's the beautiful part, Marcus. She actually thinks we're going to work it out. She's out there right now researching marriage counselors, and I've already got the divorce papers drawn up and sitting in a drawer. The real Daniel closed his eyes. He could not watch the faces in the gallery. He could not watch his wife. A second voice came through the speakers, Marcus on the recording cautious. You sure about this? 14 years is a long time, Daniel. 14 years of her spending my money and giving nothing back, recorded, Daniel said, and there was no warmth in it now, only contempt. I'm done. But here's the thing, Marcus. I'm not just going to divorce her. Any fool can get divorced. I'm going to make absolutely sure she walks out of this with nothing, and I'm going to make absolutely sure that when it's over, everyone believes she deserved it. I've been building the ground for 2 years. Everyone already thinks she's fragile. Everyone already thinks she's unstable. I made certain of that. When the moment comes, I close the accounts. I freeze her out of the properties, and by the time she understands what's happening to her, she's got no money, no lawyer, and not a single person left who believes a word out of her mouth. In the front row, a reporter had stopped writing entirely. She simply stared at the screen, her pen frozen above the page. "And if she fights back?" recorded Marcus asked. "She won't. She doesn't have it in her. That woman apologizes to furniture she bumps into." A laugh. "But if she somehow does, we say she's paranoid. We've got Feld ready to go. We've got the whole picture painted. Fragile wife, patient husband, tragic marriage he tried so hard to save. The public will eat it with a spoon. By the time I'm finished with her, Marcus, she'll be lucky if a landlord lets her rent a one-bedroom." The courtroom made a sound, then a low collective murmur of revulsion, dozens of people recoiling from the same thing at the same instant. Emily sat perfectly still, listening to her husband describe the methodical demolition of her entire life, as casually as a man describing a quarterly plan, which to Daniel it had been. That was the part that would stay with everyone who heard it. Not the cruelty of the words, but the ease of them. But Rachel did not stop the recording, because it went further. It went much, much further. "There's one problem," recorded Marcus said, and his voice on the tape dropped lower. "If the divorce lawyers start digging into the finances, Coastline, the transfers, if somebody pulls that thread," and here the recorded Daniel so sure of himself, so absolutely certain that no ear but Marcus's would ever hear him said the words that turned a bitter divorce into a federal criminal case. "Nobody's going to pull that thread, and even if they did, so what? Coastline is clean on paper. Coastline was never the real problem." A pause, the sound of him settling deeper into his chair. "The real problem is the quarterly reports. If anyone ever puts what we showed the investors next to what we showed ourselves, we're both finished. That's the thing that has to stay in the ground, Marcus. Not the divorce money, the reports. We adjusted 3 years of quarterlies, 3 years. We told the investors we were climbing while we were bleeding out. If that ever surfaces, it isn't a lawsuit, and it isn't a fine. It's federal prison. For me, for you, and probably for Halston and Price on the board, because they signed off on numbers they thought were real." The screen showed only a still frame and a moving waveform now, but not one person in that courtroom was looking at the screen. Every eye was fixed on Daniel Whitmore, the real one sitting rigid and gray at the defense table, while his own recorded voice calmly confessed to years of securities fraud in front of 40 reporters, a federal courthouse, and a room full of witnesses who would remember this morning for the rest of their lives. The criminal specialist beside Victor had gone completely still. He leaned in and whispered something fast and urgent, and Victor whispered back, and their two faces told the whole story without a single audible word. There was nothing to be done. It was already out. It was already spreading. Every reporter in the room was transmitting it in real time, and out in the world it was becoming the only story that mattered. On the recording, Marcus sounded suddenly nervous. "You really shouldn't say any of that out loud, even here, even to me." "Why not?" Recorded. Daniel laughed easy and untroubled. "This is my house. This is the most secure room I own. Nobody hears a single thing inside these walls except me and the people I choose to let in. Relax, Marcus. Nobody's listening. Nobody's listening." The two words rang out through the silent courtroom, and their cruelty was almost too much to bear. Because someone had been listening the whole time. The woman he had erased, the wife he had forgotten. She had been listening for 14 years, and now the entire world was listening with her. Rachel let the recording play all the way to its end, and then she let the silence sit for a full 10 seconds, which in a courtroom is close to unbearable. "That was the voice of Daniel Whitmore," she said at last quietly, in his own office, 8 months before he filed for divorce, telling his business partner that he intended to destroy his wife's life, that he had spent 2 years manufacturing a false reputation of mental illness to discredit her before she ever knew she needed defending, and that he and Mr. Reed had falsified 3 years of quarterly financial reports, deceiving their investors and implicating at least 2 members of their own board of directors. "Your Honor, this is no longer a divorce. Shanti Asyama Tanisa." Judge Reyes was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all its briskness. It was heavy and grave. "No, it is not." She looked toward the defense table. Mr. Caldwell, does your client wish to respond in any way to what this court has just heard? Victor rose slowly. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the span of a single recording. Your Honor, I would ask for a recess to confer with my client and with co-counsel but before the judge could rule on it, something happened that no one in the room had anticipated. Marcus Reed stood up. He had been sitting in the front row of the gallery, and now he was on his feet, and his voice shook so badly he could barely control it. Your Honor, I need to speak. I need my own attorney, and I need it noted right now this second that I am not going down for this alone. That was his plan. All of it. The reports, the fraud, the numbers, every piece of it was Daniel's idea, and I was following his instructions as an employee follows an employer, and I want that on the record before another word is said in this room. Marcus, sit down. Daniel had twisted around in his chair, and his voice was a low, furious hiss. Shut your mouth. Shut it right now. I will not shut my mouth. Marcus's voice cracked straight down the middle. You sat there through that entire recording, and you didn't even flinch. Do you know why? Because you'd sell me to save yourself without blinking. You always would have. I've known it for 19 years. Well, not this time, not today, not anymore. He turned back to the judge, wild-eyed and desperate. I'll testify to all of it. I have documents, I have emails. Every fraudulent report came down from him, in his words on his orders, and I can prove it. The courtroom erupted. Reporters were on their feet. The judge was hammering her gavel. Two men who had called each other partners and friends for 19 years were now turning on each other in open court, in front of the world, each one clawing to be the first to hand the other over to save himself. Order! Judge Reyes commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. Order in this courtroom. Mr. Reed, you will sit down. If you have a statement to make, you will make it through your own counsel at the proper time and the proper form, and not by shouting across my courtroom. Sit down. Now. Marcus sat still, shaking, but the damage was already done, and it could not be undone. The partnership had shattered in front of everyone, and the ugliness of it, the sight of the two of them turning on each other like drowning men fighting over a single plank, told the gallery more about the true nature of these men than any recording ever could. It was 10:40 in the morning. Daniel sat motionless. Something in him had simply gone out like a light switched off. The recording had been the confession, but Marcus rising to his feet, Marcus turning, that had been the moment Daniel understood all the way down that he had lost everything. Not just the case, not just the money, everything, the empire, the reputation, the freedom, 19 years of partnership, 14 years of marriage, all of it gone, and every bit of it his own doing, recorded in his own voice, in the most secure room he owned on the day he was certain that nobody was listening. He turned at last and looked at Emily, and Emily looked back at him. For 14 years, she had looked at this man across dinner tables and hotel lobbies and cold, silent beds, and always she had looked at him the way a small creature looks at something larger and more dangerous than itself. Watchful, careful, braced. But now, for the first time in all those years, she looked at him as an equal. No, more than an equal. She looked at him the way a person looks at something that used to terrify them and no longer holds any power at all. And what rose in her, to her own quiet surprise, was not triumph, and it was not hatred. It was a vast, still, almost overwhelming relief. Why? Daniel said. He did not shout it. He barely spoke it at all. But in that momentary hush, she heard it, and she understood that it was the only honest question the man had left in him. Why didn't you just take the settlement? You could have walked away with something. Why did you have to do all of this? And Emily, who had rehearsed no speech, who had prepared no words for this moment, found that the answer rose in her simply and completely the way truth does when a person has finally stopped being afraid of it. Because for 14 years you told me I was nothing, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner because the entire room had gone still to hear it. You told me I was fragile. You told me I couldn't understand money, couldn't survive on my own, couldn't be believed by anyone. And the worst part, Daniel, the part I don't think I will ever forgive, is that after enough years I started to believe you. I started to look in the mirror and see the exact woman you described. Small, foolish, broken, a woman who couldn't be trusted with her own life. She paused and her eyes stayed dry and clear and level on his. I didn't do this for the money. I truly don't care about the money. I did this because I needed to know, and I needed you to know, and I needed every single person in this room to know that the woman you spent 14 years describing never existed. You invented her, and then you spent our entire marriage trying to force me to become her. She shook her head slowly. I am not her. I never was. And now finally for the rest of your life you cannot tell a single soul that I am. Because they all just heard the truth about which one of us was broken, in your own voice. Daniel had no answer. For the first time in his entire life, Daniel Whitmore opened his mouth and found that there was absolutely nothing inside him to say. Judge Reyes allowed the moment to pass. Then she spoke, and her words carried the full weight of what she was about to set in motion. This court will now take a recess. When we return, I intend to rule on the matters properly before me in this divorce proceeding, and I will do so quickly because on the evidence I have seen, they are not close questions. However, I want the record to reflect the following clearly and permanently. This morning, this court has heard evidence in Mr. Whitmore's own recorded voice describing what appears to be a deliberate, multi-year scheme of financial fraud affecting investors and third parties who trusted him. That evidence extends far beyond the scope of a divorce. I am therefore directing my clerk to preserve the complete record of these proceedings, including the recording entered into evidence today, and to forward that record to the appropriate federal authorities for their review and action. Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Reed, I would very strongly advise you both to retain competent criminal counsel before the end of this day. We are adjourned. The gavel came down. And with that single strike, the machinery of Daniel Whitmore's destruction, the machinery he himself had designed, installed, and set in motion the cameras he had bought to guard his secrets, finished its work by handing every one of those secrets to the world. The courtroom erupted a final time, reporters flooding toward the doors, phones already pressed to ears, the story tearing outward at the speed of light. Daniel Whitmore, billionaire, self-made genius, the untouchable man brought down by his own voice in his own words, in a divorce trial he had personally insisted on making public for the single reason that he had wanted to watch his wife suffer in front of an audience. He did not move as the room emptied around him. Victor was speaking to him urgently. The criminal lawyer was speaking too low and fast. Daniel heard none of it. He was watching Emily gather her small folder, rise from her chair, and turn toward the doors. She stopped just for a moment beside the plaintiff's table. She did not look back at him. She had said everything she would ever need to say to Daniel Whitmore. Instead, she turned to Rachel and to Harold, and she said something too quiet for any reporter to catch 3 simple words that the two of them would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Thank you, truly. Rachel put a hand briefly over hers. Harold, who had spent 4 months buried in the wreckage of one man's lies, simply nodded, unable to speak. And then Emily Whitmore walked out of the courtroom, past the reporters shouting her name, past the cameras and the microphones and the noise, past the wreckage of the man who had tried so patiently, so completely to erase her from the world, and out into the light of a life that was at last entirely and only her own. Behind her at the defense table, Daniel Whitmore sat alone. Marcus was already gone, swallowed up by his own lawyers in the hallway, already cutting his own deal, already trading 19 years of loyalty for a shorter sentence. Victor was packing his files with the grim, quiet efficiency of a man stepping off a sinking ship before it pulled him under. And Daniel, for the first time in his entire adult life, was completely and utterly alone in an emptying courtroom, with the echo of his own recorded voice still hanging in the silent air. Nobody's listening. He had been so certain of it, and it had proven to be the single most expensive mistake a man had ever made. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. Outside the tall windows, the sun was bright and ordinary, and somewhere out in that ordinary brightness, a woman he had spent 14 years teaching to believe she was small was walking straight-backed and clear-eyed toward every single thing he had sworn to her she would never have. The recess lasted 40 minutes, and in those 40 minutes the world outside the courtroom changed faster than anyone inside it could keep up with. By the time Judge Reyes returned to the bench at 11:40, the recording had already been played on 3 national networks. Daniel Whitmore's own voice saying nobody's listening was echoing out of televisions and phones in millions of homes across the country. The words that had been meant to bury Emily had become the words that buried him, and they were multiplying by the second. But Daniel did not know any of that yet. He sat at the defense table where he had sat all morning, and the only world he could see was the one inside those four walls, the world that was about to deliver its verdict. Judge Reyes settled into her chair and looked out over a courtroom that had gone silent again. "We are back on the record in the matter of Whitmore versus Whitmore. Before I rule, I want to say something, and I want the record to reflect it precisely." She removed her glasses and set them down, which those who knew her understood was never a good sign for the person she was about to address. "In 22 years on this bench, I have presided over a great many divorces. Most of them are sad. Some are bitter. A few are cruel. But I do not believe I have ever in all that time seen a proceeding in which one party so deliberately, so patiently, and so completely attempted to weaponize a court of law against the person they once married. Mr. Whitmore, you did not come to this court seeking a fair division of a marriage. You came here to finish a plan. You wanted this court to be the final instrument in the destruction of your wife. You wanted the judge, the press, and the public to certify a version of events that you had spent 2 years manufacturing. And you were confident enough, arrogant enough to believe it would work." Daniel did not look up. "It did not work," the judge continued, "because the woman you spent 14 years describing as fragile and incapable was in fact methodically documenting the truth the entire time. She was not too weak to understand what was happening to her. She understood it better than you did. And she had the extraordinary composure to wait and to prepare and to let you tell your story in full before she told the truth." She put her glasses back on. "Here are my rulings." The room leaned in. On the matter of the marital assets, Mr. Whitmore's claim that his wife was financially irresponsible is not merely unsupported by the evidence, it is directly contradicted by it. The evidence establishes that Mr. Whitmore engaged in a systematic effort to conceal marital assets through a series of shell companies, offshore transfers, and undisclosed accounts in direct violation of his obligation to make full financial disclosure to this court. His financial disclosures are hereby found to be fraudulent. A murmur moved through the gallery. When a party to a divorce is found to have deliberately concealed assets and submitted fraudulent disclosures, this court has broad discretion to remedy that fraud. I intend to exercise that discretion fully. Mrs. Whitmore is awarded the entirety of the identifiable marital estate, including the primary residence, the secondary properties, and all accounts that can be traced as marital property. Furthermore, given the deliberate concealment, I am ordering a full forensic accounting of the concealed assets at Mr. Whitmore's expense, and Mrs. Whitmore will be awarded her rightful share of every dollar that accounting uncovers. Victor closed his eyes. On the matter of spousal support, given the duration of the marriage, the disparity in circumstances created by Mr. Whitmore's conduct, and the deliberate financial abuse documented in the evidence, including the closure of a joint account timed to a family medical emergency, Mrs. Whitmore is awarded spousal support at the maximum the guidelines allow to continue until further order of this court. Daniel's hands were flat on the table now, pressing down as if he could hold himself steady against what was coming. And on the matter of Mr. Whitmore's characterization of his wife's mental state, the judge's voice hardened. The court finds that Mr. Whitmore engaged in a deliberate documented campaign to fabricate a false impression of his wife's mental instability for the express purpose of discrediting her should she ever tell the truth. The court further finds that the defense's own witness, Dr. Feld, was a paid participant in that campaign. This conduct is among the most disturbing I have encountered. It will be reflected in full in this court's written findings, and I have no doubt it will be of interest to the authorities now reviewing this matter. Mrs. Whitmore leaves this courtroom with her character fully vindicated and her reputation restored by the plain facts of the record. She paused. The marriage of Daniel and Emily Whitmore is hereby dissolved. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down for the final time, and it was over. 14 years of marriage, 2 years of scheming, 1 week of trial, all of it ended in the space of a single ruling, and every part of it had landed exactly opposite to the way Daniel had planned. Emily did not move at first. She sat very still, her hands folded, and she let the words settle over her one by one. Awarded the estate, vindicated, restored, dissolved. For 14 years, she had believed somewhere deep down that if it ever came to this, she would lose. That he was too powerful, too smart, too protected. That the world would side with him because the world always sided with men like him. And now the world had not. Now a judge had looked at the truth she had carried alone for so long and had called it exactly what it was. She felt Rachel's hand close gently over hers. "It's done, Emily," Rachel said softly. "It's really done. You won." But Emily shook her head slowly, and when she spoke, her voice was thick. "I didn't win, Rachel. I survived. There's a difference, and I'm only just now starting to understand it." Across the aisle, Daniel finally moved. He turned to Victor and his voice was hollow, stripped of everything that had made it powerful. "The federal thing, the referral. How bad is it? Tell me the truth." Victor looked at him for a long moment before answering, and when he did not soften it. "Daniel, I handle divorces. What's coming for you now is not my area, and I'm not going to lie to you about it. You confessed to 3 years of securities fraud on a recording that has now been played on national television. Your partner is already in a room somewhere across this building offering to testify against you in exchange for leniency. 2 of your board members are named. Investors who lost money are going to come out of the walls with lawsuits, and the government is going to build its case on evidence you handed them yourself." He gathered his files. "So how bad is it? It's as bad as it gets. My honest advice, as the last piece of advice I'll give you, is to find the best criminal defense attorney money can still buy and to prepare yourself for the very real possibility of prison. I'm sorry, but you did this. Every part of it you did to yourself." And Victor Caldwell, the most expensive divorce lawyer in California, snapped his briefcase shut and walked out of Daniel Whitmore's life without looking back. Daniel sat alone. It was nearly noon. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaos. Reporters had massed on the steps 3 deep, and when Emily emerged with Rachel and Harold at her side, a wall of cameras and shouted questions rose up to meet her. "Mrs. Whitmore, how do you feel? Mrs. Whitmore, did you know about the fraud? Mrs. Whitmore, what would you say to your husband right now?" Emily stopped at the top of the steps. She had not planned to speak. Rachel had advised her to say nothing to let the record speak for itself, and Emily had agreed. But standing there with the cameras in her face and the questions crashing over her, she felt something rise up in her that she could not hold down. Not anger, something steadier than anger. She raised a hand and slowly the shouting died down. "I'm not going to say much," Emily began, and her voice, though quiet, carried across the crowd. "But there's one thing I want to say, and I want to say it to a specific group of people, not to the reporters, not to my former husband, to the people watching this at home right now who know exactly what I'm talking about." She paused, and the crowd went quiet. There are people watching right now who are living inside a version of what I lived inside. People who have been told over and over for so long that they've started to believe it, that they're too weak, too foolish, too broken to leave. People who have been made to feel invisible in their own homes. People who have been made to doubt their own memory, their own mind, their own worth. Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. "I was one of you. For 14 years I was one of you. And I need you to hear me say this, because I needed someone to say it to me, and no one ever did. You are not what they tell you you are. The person they describe when they want to diminish you does not exist. They invented her, and you do not have to become her." Somewhere in the crowd, a reporter had stopped filming and was simply listening. "I didn't have a plan for years," Emily went on. "I didn't have courage for years. What I had was one small, stubborn habit. Every night I wrote down what happened that day, just the truth, just what was real. Even when no one believed me, even when I barely believed myself, I kept a record of the truth. And in the end, that record was the thing that set me free." She looked directly into the nearest camera. So if you are living inside a lie about who you are, start keeping a record of the truth. Write it down, save it, tell one person you trust, because the truth is patient, and it is stronger than any lie, and one day it will be the thing that carries you out. It carried me out. It can carry you too. She stepped back from the cameras. That's all I have to say. And she walked down the steps, and the crowd, which moments before had been a wall of noise, parted for her in something close to silence. That short, unplanned speech on the courthouse steps would be watched more than 40 million times in the weeks that followed. It would be shared by people who had never shared anything. It would be printed out and taped to refrigerators and bathroom mirrors. Letters would begin to arrive, thousands of them, from people who had heard a woman on a set of courthouse steps say out loud the thing they had never been able to say to themselves. But Emily did not know any of that yet. In that moment, she only knew that she had said the truth out loud in front of the world, and that no one had told her to be quiet. It was 12:15 in the afternoon. The days that followed moved fast, the way things move fast once a dam has broken. The federal investigation that Judge Reyes had set in motion did not crawl. It ran. Within 72 hours, agents had seized records from Whitmore's company headquarters. Within a week, Marcus Reed had formally agreed to cooperate, turning over 19 years of emails, memos, and instructions, every one of them documenting Daniel's role as the architect of the fraud. The two board members named on the recording, Halston and Price, hired their own attorneys and began frantically to distance themselves from a man they had once been proud to stand beside. Daniel's empire did not collapse gradually. It fell all at once the way a building falls when the central column is pulled. His company's stock, once the pride of the financial press, cratered as the fraud became public, and the investors he had deceived for 3 years discovered exactly how much of their trust had been built on lies. Board members resigned. Partners severed ties. The banks that had once competed to lend him money now competed to call in what he owed. The man who had built an empire from nothing watched it return to nothing, and he watched it in isolation, because one by one, everyone who had orbited his wealth and power simply stopped taking his calls. The magazines that had once called him a self-made genius now ran his photograph beside the word disgraced. The same journalists who had described his flawless public image now competed to expose the machinery behind it. And the phrase from the recording, "Nobody's listening," became a kind of grim shorthand across the country, a caution, a punchline, an epitaph for a certain kind of arrogance. Emily watched some of it and turned away from most of it, because here was the thing that surprised her, the thing she had not expected. She took no pleasure in it. She had thought in her darkest years that she would feel triumphant watching Daniel fall. She had imagined it sometimes on the worst nights as a kind of comfort. But now that it was actually happening, she felt none of the triumph she had imagined. She felt something quieter and stranger. She felt mostly a kind of sorrow. Not for Daniel. She would never again spend her sorrow on Daniel. But sorrow for the 14 years, for the woman she had been, for all that time spent so small. "I thought I'd be happy," she admitted to Rachel one afternoon a few weeks after the trial, sitting in Rachel's office, where the whole thing had begun. "I thought watching him lose everything would fill something in me, and it doesn't. It doesn't fill anything. It just makes the emptiness quieter." Rachel nodded slowly. "That's because revenge was never actually what you wanted. You thought it was because it was the only shape your pain could take for a long time, but it was never the real thing." "Then what was the real thing?" Rachel considered this question. "To be believed," she said finally. "That's all it ever was, Emily. From the first day you walked in here with that shoebox, you didn't want him to suffer. You wanted someone to look at the truth and say, yes, this is real, this happened to you, you are not crazy. That's what you were starving for. And you got it. A judge said it. The world said it. And now the hunger is gone, and what's left underneath is just the grief of everything it cost you to get here. That's not a failure, Emily. That's healing. It just doesn't feel the way people think it will." Emily was quiet for a long moment. "Harold said something to me during the trial," she said. "He said a confused woman doesn't document a decade of financial fraud. He said the record told the opposite story from the one Daniel told about me. I keep coming back to that, because for so long I believed Daniel's version, and I'm only now starting to believe Harold's." "Believe Harold's," Rachel said gently. "It's the true one. It always was." There was one more encounter Emily had not anticipated, and it came about 6 weeks after the trial, when the criminal proceedings against Daniel had begun in earnest. She received a message passed through his new attorney that Daniel wanted to see her, just once, before things went where they were going. Rachel advised strongly against it. Harold advised against it. Everyone advised against it. Emily went anyway, not because Daniel wanted it, because she wanted it, because she had spent 14 years having her choices made for her, and this was a choice she intended to make for herself. They met in a small room with lawyers present in a building neither of them had ever wanted to enter. And the man who sat across the table from her was almost unrecognizable. Not physically, though he had aged. It was something else. The confidence that had defined him for as long as she had known him, the certainty that had radiated off him in every room he entered was simply gone. What sat across from her now was a man who had run out of story to tell. "You came," Daniel said. "I came," Emily said, "but not for the reason you think. Whatever you're about to ask me for, the answer is no. I'm not here to help you. I'm not here to forgive you. I'm not sure I ever will, and I've decided I don't have to. I'm here for me, not for you." Daniel looked down at his hands. "I don't know what I was going to ask you for. I've had a lot of time to think, and I still don't know." He was quiet for a moment. "I keep going back to that question I asked you in the courtroom. Why you didn't just take the settlement. And I think I finally understand the answer. And it's not the one you gave." Emily said nothing. She waited. "You didn't do it to expose me," Daniel said slowly. "You did it because as long as I could tell the world that story about you, some part of you would always half believe it. You didn't need me destroyed. You needed the story destroyed. And the only way to kill the story was to let everyone hear the truth." He looked up. "That's it, isn't it?" And Emily was startled because for the first time in 14 years, Daniel had actually seen her, truly seen her. Now, when it was far too late to matter, when there was nothing left to gain from it, he had finally understood something true about the woman he had married. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's it." "I spent 14 years, Daniel said, and his voice broke slightly, "believing I understood you completely. And it turns out I never understood you at all. I made you up, and I believed my own invention so completely that I forgot there was a real person underneath it." He shook his head. "The most dangerous thing I ever did wasn't the fraud or the accounts or any of it. It was deciding I already knew who you were and never checking again." Emily stood up. She had heard what she came without knowing it to hear. Not an apology. She did not want his apology and would not have believed it. What she had come for, she realized now, was this: to sit across from him as a whole person fully herself, and to watch him finally see her, and to feel absolutely nothing pull her back toward him. No fear, no longing, no old reflex of smallness, nothing at all. And she felt it, the nothing. And the nothing was the most freeing thing she had ever felt. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said. She walked to the door. And this time, unlike every other time in 14 years, she did not glance back to see whether he approved. She did not glance back at all. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when she stepped out of that building into the ordinary light of an ordinary day. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Emily Whitmore did not feel like she was carrying anything at all. The weight she had carried for 14 years, the shoebox of it, the record of it, the terrible patient hope of it, had finally been set down. A judge had believed her. The world had believed her. And at last, hardest of all, she had begun to believe herself. Behind her in the room she had left, Daniel Whitmore sat with his lawyers and his ruin, and the long proceedings ahead of him, a man who had learned the truth about his wife on the exact day it could do him no good at all. He had wanted more than anything to be the one who decided who Emily Whitmore was. In the end, she had decided it herself. And there was nothing he could do about it, and nothing he could ever do about it again. The letters started arriving in the second week, and they did not stop. Emily had given no address, but people are resourceful when something has cracked open inside them, and they found her anyway. Through the foundation that did not yet exist, through Rachel's office, through the law firm's front desk, where a receptionist began keeping a growing box under her counter, labeled simply in careful handwriting for Emily. They wrote by the hundreds, then by the thousands, and every letter, no matter how different the handwriting or the circumstances, seemed to say the same thing underneath the words. "You said it out loud. You said the thing I could never say. I thought I was the only one in the world who felt it." She read every one. She insisted on it. Rachel had suggested gently that she couldn't possibly keep up, that no one would blame her for letting an assistant sort them into piles. But Emily shook her head with a firmness that surprised them both. "Someone kept a record of these people their entire lives," she said, "and the record was always the same. Nobody's listening. I am not going to become one more person who doesn't listen to them." So she read them. At her kitchen table late into the night, the way she had once written her own truth late into the night, while a dangerous man slept in the next room. And somewhere around the 400th letter, sitting alone with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, Emily understood exactly what she was going to do with the rest of her life. One letter in particular stopped her cold. It was from a woman in Ohio, 3 pages long in handwriting that grew shakier as it went. The woman described a marriage that could have been a photocopy of Emily's own, down to the smallest cruelties. And at the very end, she had written a single sentence that Emily would carry for years. "I don't want to leave him. I want someone to tell me I'm not crazy for wanting to." And Emily set that letter down and put her face in her hands because she remembered, with a clarity that took her breath away, being exactly that woman. Not brave enough yet to want freedom, only brave enough to want permission to want it. It was 3 weeks after the trial when she called Rachel. "I want to start something," Emily said, "and I want your help to do it right, so it can't be undone by anyone with more money than sense. I've seen what money can undo. I want to build something it can't touch." "I'm listening," Rachel said. "There are people in that pile of letters," Emily said, "who are exactly where I was 2 years ago. They have the truth, and no money, and no lawyer, and not one single person who believes them. That was me, Rachel. That was me standing in your office with a shoebox and hands I couldn't hold still. And if you had turned me away because I couldn't pay, I would still be trapped in that penthouse right now, believing every word Daniel ever told me about who I was." "But I didn't turn you away." "No, you didn't. And that one choice you made saved my entire life. I want to make that choice available to everyone. I want to build the thing I needed and couldn't have afforded. A place where a person can walk in with a shoebox and shaking hands and no money at all and be believed and be helped. Legal help, financial help, the forensic work Harold did for me, housing if they need it, all of it, for free, for the people who could never in 1,000 years afford what I couldn't afford." There was a silence on the line. When Rachel spoke, her voice was not quite steady. "You want to build the room you needed." "I want to build the room I needed," Emily said, "so that the next woman who keeps a record of the truth in the dark doesn't have to keep it alone." Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Emily could hear her breathing, could almost hear her thinking. "You understand what you're asking me," Rachel finally said. "You're asking me to leave the firm, to walk away from partnership, from the money." "I'm asking," Emily said carefully. "I'm not demanding. If it's too much, I'll do it," Rachel said, and there was no hesitation in it at all. "I'll leave the firm. I'll run the legal side. I've spent 12 years winning cases for people who could already afford to win. Your case was the first one in a long time where I felt like I was actually doing what I became a lawyer to do." A pause. "And I already know Harold will do the financial side because he's been a different man since your case, Emily. He called me last week out of nowhere just to talk about it. He told me it was the first time in years he felt like the numbers were on the side of the right person. He said he was tired of finding money for people who already had too much of it." "Then ask him," Emily said. "When do we start?" "We already started," Emily said quietly. 3 weeks ago, in a courtroom. We just didn't have a name for it yet." Harold said yes before Rachel finished the question. He said it, she reported back, with a kind of relief in his voice, the relief of a man who had been waiting a long time to be asked to do something that mattered. And so the three of them, the woman who had kept the record, the lawyer who had believed her, and the investigator who had found the truth in the numbers, became the founders of something none of them had planned and all of them needed. They named it the Whitmore Foundation at first. And then 2 days before the launch, Emily changed her mind, and she changed her name along with it. She had been born Emily Morgan before 14 years of marriage had folded her into someone else's name and someone else's story. And she decided quietly and completely that she would live the rest of her life the way she had begun it, as herself, under her own name. "The Morgan Foundation," she told Rachel over coffee, "not Whitmore. I gave that man 14 years of my life. He is not getting my name for the rest of it, too. Rachel raised an eyebrow. You realize your name and mine are almost the same, Morgan and Morgan. Emily smiled, and it was a smile with an edge to it that the old Emily could never have managed. I know. I thought about that, and I decided I liked it. Two women named Morgan running a place that helps people, the powerful thought they could throw away. She stirred her coffee slowly. And I'll be honest with you, Rachel. There's a small petty part of me that likes what it'll do to Daniel. Wherever he ends up, he's going to hear about it. A foundation with my old name and your last name, helping the exact kind of person he spent his whole life stepping on. Everything he built to destroy me became the seed of the best thing I'll ever do. Let him sit with that. Rachel laughed, the first real, full laugh Emily had heard from her since the trial. You've changed, Emily. The woman who first walked into my office 2 years ago never in a million years would have said that out loud. The woman who walked into your office 2 years ago, Emily said, and her voice softened, didn't know she was allowed to have wants of her own. She didn't know she was allowed to take up space. She spent 14 years apologizing for existing. She looked up. I'm done apologizing for existing, Rachel. I earned this space. I bled for it. I'm going to fill it. The launch was held 4 months after the trial at a modest venue Emily chose on purpose because it was not grand. She had been finished with grand for a long time. Grand was Daniel's word. Grand was penthouses and galas and a life so polished you could see your own diminishment reflected in it. She wanted a room that felt like a kitchen table, a room where a frightened person could breathe. She stood in front of a crowd that included former clients, turned volunteers, lawyers who had heard her courthouse speech and driven in from 3 states away to offer their time for nothing, and dozens of the letter writers, the people who had found the courage to come and stand in a room full of others who understood without needing to be told. And Emily Morgan stepped up to speak, not as a billionaire's wife, not as the woman on the courthouse steps that 40 million people had watched, as herself. As a woman who had rebuilt her own name with her own 2 hands. 2 years ago, she began, and the room went quiet. I believed I was nothing. I want to be precise about that because I think people on the outside imagine it as a feeling, a bad mood, something you could shake off if you really tried. It is not a feeling. It is a fact. You have been taught 1 repetition at a time until it lives inside you as solidly as your own name. I believed I was nothing because a man I trusted told me so every single day for 14 years until his voice replaced my own inside my head. There came a point where I could not tell you where his lies ended and my own thoughts began. That is what it does to you. That is the part nobody understands until they've lived it. It doesn't just take your money or your freedom or your friends. It takes your voice. And then it convinces you that you never had one to begin with. Some people in the room were already crying. Emily did not look away from them. She looked right at them because she knew that being looked at, being seen, was the exact thing they had been starved of. I want to tell you the thing that saved me, she went on, because it is smaller and simpler than you would ever expect, and I think its smallness is the most important part. It was not courage. I want to be honest about that because everyone keeps calling me brave and I wasn't. Not for years. I was terrified for years. It was not a clever plan either. I didn't have a plan until very near the very end. What I had was a notebook and a habit and 1 single stubborn refusal that I could not have explained to you at the time. She held up her hand as if holding an invisible pen. Every night, no matter how small I felt, no matter how much I doubted my own memory, no matter how completely I'd been convinced during the day that I was imagining things I wrote down what was true. Just what actually happened. Just the facts in my own words in a place he couldn't reach. She lowered her hand. I did it for years without understanding why. I told myself I was just trying to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. But what I was really doing without knowing it was keeping my own voice alive. On paper, where he couldn't get to it and couldn't rewrite it. So that on the day I finally needed my voice, it was still there, still mine, still true. He had taken it out of my mouth, but he never found where I'd hidden it. She let that settle over the room. That is what this foundation is. It is not a charity exactly. It is a place that says to every single person who walks through that door, We will help you keep your voice alive. We will believe you when no one else in your life will. We will do the work you cannot afford to do alone, and we will stay beside you until the truth you have been carrying by yourself in the dark for months or years or decades finally gets to stand up in the light and be heard by someone who matters." Her voice grew stronger, filling the modest room. "Because I know better than almost anyone alive in this country what it costs to carry the truth alone. And I know exactly what it is worth when someone finally helps you set it down. The applause did not come the way applause usually comes, all at once and polite. It came slowly, person by person, as people rose to their feet, some of them still wiping their faces until the entire room was standing. And Emily stood in front of them, this woman who 2 years earlier could not withdraw $40 for her own mother's medicine, and she let herself feel fully and without a single flicker of guilt the thing she had earned, not triumph. She had learned over these months that triumph had never been what she was after. Peace. She let herself feel peace, and she let it fill her all the way up. The foundation grew faster than any of them had dared to expect. Within the first year, it had helped over 300 people walk out of situations they had believed were permanent. Within 2 years, it had chapters in 4 states, and Rachel had trained a whole staff of lawyers who worked for a fraction of what they could have earned elsewhere, because the work fed something the money never had. Harold came fully out of his semi-retirement to build a forensic team, and he became known among the staff as the man who could find money that powerful people were absolutely certain they had buried forever. He liked to say with a dry little smile, developed a taste for it. But the growth was not the part that changed Emily. What changed her was who walked through the door. Because the people they helped were not most of them married to billionaires. That was the thing Emily came to understand most deeply in those years, and it reshaped how she saw the entire world. The mechanism Daniel had used on her was not a mechanism of the wealthy. It was a mechanism of control, and control wore 1,000 faces and lived at every single level of society. A woman whose husband controlled her paycheck down to the dollar. A young man whose partner had spent 5 years convincing him he was too stupid and too helpless to survive on his own. An elderly mother whose own son had quietly drained her savings while telling every relative that poor mom was losing her mind. The size of the fortune changed, the address changed, the story underneath never changed at all. Someone with power had told someone without it, over and over, "You are nothing, you are crazy, no one will ever believe you." And the foundation existed for one reason above all others, to say back clearly and with evidence, "We believe you and we can prove it." There was a night about a year in that Emily never forgot. A woman named Denise came in 63 years old who had spent 40 years married to a man who controlled every aspect of her life. She sat across from Emily in the intake room, and she could not stop apologizing. She apologized for taking up Emily's time. She apologized for not having documents. She apologized for crying. She apologized for the way her hands shook. And Emily reached across the table and took those shaking hands, and she said the things she had needed someone to say to her. "Denise, listen to me. You have nothing to apologize for, not one thing. The shaking hands, the crying, the not having documents, all of that is not weakness. That is the evidence. That is what 40 years of being told you're nothing does to a person, and it is not your fault, and it does not mean he was right about you." She held on. "You are not crazy. You are not too old. You are not too late. And you are not alone anymore. Do you hear me? As of this moment, you are not alone." Denise wept, and Emily held her hands, and later that night, Emily went home and sat at her kitchen table and understood that she had just watched herself from the outside. She had just been Rachel for someone else. The circle had closed and opened again wider. As for Daniel, the criminal proceedings ground forward over those same 2 years, slow and heavy and final. Marcus Reed's cooperation had been thorough and devastating, exactly as Marcus had promised in that whispered threat before the trial. The 2 board members, Halston and Price, had followed Marcus into cooperation to save their own skins, and the investors had come precisely as Victor Caldwell had predicted. Out of the walls, dozens of them, then hundreds, each one holding the memory of a man who had shaken their hand and looked them in the eye and lied. The recording that had ended the divorce became the cornerstone of the fraud case, and Daniel's own voice saying the words he had been so certain no one would ever hear was played again in a second courtroom, this one federal in front of a jury that did not know Emily and did not need to. He was convicted on nearly every count. Emily did not attend the sentencing and did not follow it closely, and felt when Rachel quietly told her the outcome over the phone almost nothing at all. She noted the absence of feeling with a kind of wonder. 2 years earlier, the thought of Daniel's downfall had been the only warmth available to her on the coldest nights. She had rationed it out to herself like medicine, and now that it had finally arrived in full, she found she had no use for it. The man who had once controlled every hour of her life could no longer command a single one of her afternoons, that she decided was the truest measure of how far she had traveled. Not that he had fallen, but that his falling no longer moved her. "Are you all right?" Rachel had asked after telling her. "I'm fine," Emily said, and was surprised to find it was completely true. "I keep waiting to feel something, and there's just nothing there. Is that strange?" "It's not strange," Rachel said. "It's the opposite of strange. It means you're finally free of him. As long as you were still capable of feeling triumph over him, some part of you was still measuring your life against his. This is what it looks like when you stop." But there was one more thread, and it came as the sharpest things in Emily's life always seemed to, without any warning at all. It was nearly 2 years to the day after the trial when a young woman appeared at the Foundation's main office and asked very quietly to speak with Emily Morgan directly. The front desk staff protective of Emily's time tried gently to route her toward an intake counselor. The young woman shook her head and stood her ground. "Please," she said, "just tell her my name is Sarah. Tell her I'm Marcus Reed's daughter, and tell her I'll completely understand if she says no." The name traveled back through the office like a cold draft. Marcus Reed, the man on the recording, the partner, the one who had turned. When it reached Emily, she set down what she was doing, and after a moment she came out to the lobby herself. Sarah Reed was perhaps 25, and she stood the way people stand when they have rehearsed something so many times that they no longer trust their own mouths to deliver it. "I know I have no right to be here," she began before Emily had even sat down. "My father did terrible things. He helped your husband do terrible things to you for years. I know that. I'm not here to defend him. I could never defend him." "Then why are you here?" Emily asked. Not coldly, just honestly the way she had learned to ask everything now. "Because of my mother," Sarah said, and her carefully held composure cracked straight down the middle. "My father did to her for 30 years the exact same thing your husband did to you. Not something similar. The exact same thing. The money, the isolation, telling everyone she was unstable until she believed it about herself. I grew up inside it. I watched it every single day of my childhood, and I never had a word for what I was watching. Not until I heard your speech on the courthouse steps." Emily went very still. "I've watched it 100 times," Sarah said, tears running freely now. "More than that, and every time I understood a little more of my own life. And then one day, I finally understood all of it. What I'd been watching happened to my mother my whole life, had a name and a shape, and it wasn't her fault, and it wasn't in her head." She pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment before she could go on. "My mother left him, last month. She used the exact things you said. She started keeping a record, just like you. She wrote down what was true every night where he couldn't find it. And when the truth about my father's crimes came out, and his whole world collapsed, she was already gone, already safe, already for the first time in 30 years, starting to believe herself again, because of you." Sha. She looked at Emily with something that was almost unbearable to receive. "So I came to say thank you. From her and from me, that's all. Just thank you." Emily stood there, and the full, strange shape of it settled over her all at once. Here at last was the twist that no plan of hers could ever have arranged the terrible and perfect symmetry of it. The daughter of the man who had helped destroy her had been set free by the very words that Emily's destruction had produced. Marcus Reed had spent 19 years holding a loaded threat over Daniel's head and 30 years crushing his own wife into nothing. And in the end, the thing that finally freed that wife was the downfall Marcus himself had helped to bring about. His cooperation had destroyed Daniel. Daniel's destruction had made Emily's speech. Emily's speech had reached across the entire country and into the home of the man who had helped ruin her, and it had lifted the woman he was ruining and carried her out. The cruelty had circled all the way around the world and come back transformed into mercy, delivered to the one person Marcus Reed had hurt longest and worst. "Your mother," Emily said carefully when she could trust her voice. "Does she have help right now? Real help? Legal help? Financial help? Someone in her corner who believes her?" Sarah shook her head and her shoulders dropped. "She can't afford it. That's the whole problem. That's why I really came, if I'm honest." She left with almost nothing. He controlled every account, just like your husband did. She's free, but she's frightened, and she doesn't have the money to fight for what's hers, and she's too proud to ask, and I didn't know where else to turn. Emily reached out and took the young woman's hands the way Rachel had once taken hers, across a table in an office full of a stranger's scattered papers on the worst day of her life that had turned out to be the beginning of the best part of it. "She can afford us," Emily said. "Everyone can afford us. That is the entire point of this place. There is no bill, there is no catch, there is no fine print." She held Sarah's gaze and did not let it go. "Bring her in, whenever she's ready, tomorrow, next week, next year. There is no rush, and there is no cost, and there is no judgment. And you tell her from me that a woman who once stood in the exact place she's standing right now will personally make sure she is believed. You tell her those words, you tell her someone who has been where you are will make sure you are believed. That's a promise, not from the foundation, from me." Sarah broke down entirely then, and Emily gathered her in and held her in the lobby of a foundation named for two other women's names, a place she had built out of the wreckage of the worst thing that had ever happened to her, now catching the daughter of one of the men who had helped cause it. And in that embrace, Emily finally understood the last thing she had needed to understand, the thing that had been waiting at the bottom of everything. She had spent so long believing that what Daniel took from her was simply gone. The years, the trust, the version of herself who had walked into that marriage whole and hopeful and unafraid. And it was true, all of it, that those things did not come back. You do not get the years back. You do not get to be the person you were before you learned what people are capable of. She had made her peace with that. But she saw now, holding a weeping stranger in a quiet lobby, that what had grown up out of the ruined place was not smaller than what had been destroyed there. It was larger. She had entered her marriage as a woman who could love one man and a small handful of friends whose whole world could fit inside a single penthouse. She was walking out of her ruin as a woman whose belief could reach a stranger in a lobby, and that stranger's mother, and the thousands of letters still arriving, and every one of the hundreds of people the foundation had already carried out, and every one those people would go on to reach in their own turn for the rest of all their lives. The cruelty had been designed, engineered, perfected over years for the single purpose of making Emily smaller. And it had done, against every intention behind it, the precise and total opposite. It had made her larger than she had ever known a person could be. That night, Emily sat again at her kitchen table, the way she had sat through so many hundreds of nights in her old life. But she was not writing down what she was afraid of anymore. She was not keeping a record in the dark against a dangerous man in the next room. She took out a fresh notebook, its first page clean and blank, and hers, and for a long moment she simply looked at it. This small object that had once been the only weapon she had, the only voice she was allowed to keep. Then she wrote a single line at the top, and it was not about Daniel, and it was not about the trial, and it was not about anything that had ever been done to her. It was the names of the 3 people the foundation had helped that week. And beside each name in her own steady handwriting, she wrote the same 3 words. She is free, he is free, she is free. That was the record she kept now. Not the record of what was done to her in the dark, the record of who walked out into the light. And so the story of Emily Morgan does not end in a courtroom, and it does not end in the ruin of the man who tried to erase her. It ends at a small kitchen table in a quiet house, in the steady hand of a woman writing down the freedom of strangers, one name at a time, night after night, for the rest of a life that finally completely belonged to her. Daniel Whitmore had wanted more than money, more than victory, more than anything to be the one who got to decide who Emily was. He had spent 14 years telling her she was fragile, foolish, and forgettable. He had built an empire, a partnership, and a whole patient architecture of lies for the single purpose of making that story permanent and true. And here is the truth that outlived every last lie the man ever told. The woman he swore the world would never believe became the woman the world could not stop listening to. The woman he spent years trying to erase built a place where no frightened person would ever be erased again. And the voice he spent 14 years working to silence became the voice that reached across the whole country and set thousands of strangers free. He tried to make her nothing. She became the reason countless others finally understood that they were something. That was the one verdict Daniel Whitmore could never appeal, never buy, never intimidate, and never for as long as he lived undo. Emily Morgan was free. She had freed herself with her own hands and her own voice and her own stubborn, quiet record of the truth. And she was never, ever going to be silent again.